Hi there, folks. This is the practice chapter 9b test. And as always, I am the amazing Mr. Jansen. So away we go. If we look at the first one's just asking us to simplify this. So really, we're going to multiply, and I'm going to multiply using my distributive property. So I'm going to distribute the 2x to each of these. So I do the 2x times the x squared, which gives me a 2x cubed. Then a minus 4x squared, a plus 8x. And now I'm going to distribute the -1. So I distribute the -1 to each term. That's going to give me a negative x squared plus 2x minus 4. And now I just combine like terms. The x squareds are like terms. The x values are like terms. So I end up with a 2x cubed, a minus 5x squared, a plus 10x, and a minus 4. And that's it. And number 2, it's been a while since we've done one of these, but when we're adding or subtracting matrices, remember we just take the corresponding pieces and subtract them. So this time I'm subtracting, so I take the corresponding pieces, so the 5 minus the 2, and that gives me a 3. And then I take the next corresponding pieces, the -4 minus the 4 is a -8. And then the next set of corresponding pieces, the -1 and the -6, minus the -6, like plus a positive, that's going to be a positive 5. 8 minus a -5, that's like plus a positive, that's a 13. 0 minus 7 is a -7. And then -2 minus the -10, that's like plus a positive, that's a positive 8. Okay, so I end up with a matrix that's the same size as the original two. And if you wanted to, a great idea for this one would be to change this to adding the opposite and change the sign of each of these to make it a little bit easier. Now we're talking about addition instead of subtraction. Okay? In number 3, we're just asked to find the length of the missing side. So for this one, I have to use my Pythagorean theorem. This is the side I don't know. I can call it x or whatever I want. But the important side here is this one, the 19. That's our hypotenuse. So when I do this, I have to do x squared plus 10 squared equals the 19 squared. Okay, the hypotenuse is the important one. That's the one that has to be by itself. And I'm going to solve this. This is going to be x squared plus 100. Equals 19 squared, which is 361. And now I subtract the 100 from each side. So I find out, let me rewrite it up here, that x squared equals 261. And now from here, I'm just going to take the square root of that, and I'm going to round it to 2 decimal places. That gives me approximately a 16.16. Okay? Number 4 asked me to solve this, and remember, to solve something like this, I've got to isolate the thing that's being squared, and right now that thing is by itself. So to undo squaring something, I'm going to take the square root. So I take the square root of each side, and remember, when I take the square root of each side of an equation, I have to do plus or minus that root. So the square root of 16 is plus or minus a 4. So now I have 2 things to do after I subtract this 2 from each side. I've got an x, I've got a -2 plus or minus 4, which again means 2 things. It means I have to do a -2 plus 4, and I also have to do a -2 minus 4 to give me 2 answers here. The -2 plus 4 is a positive 2, the -2 minus 4 is a -6. So those are my 2 x values. So that's my solution set. Okay? Number 5 asks us to solve, and remember, when we're solving these, we have a couple options, either factoring, completing the square, of the quadratic formula. If it can be factored, factoring is the easiest way to go. If not, you go to completing the square or the quadratic formula. And I'll do a variety of these as I work through these problems. But this first one, we've got x squared minus 4. This one can be done by factoring. This is a difference of squares, so it factors into an x plus 2 and an x minus 2. And then we set each factor equal to 0. The x plus 2 equals 0. The x minus 2 equals 0. And now we can solve each. Over here, we subtract the 2 from each side, and we find out that x equals a -2. Over here, we add the 2 to each side, and I find out that x equals a positive 2. And those are my 2 answers. The other way to go about doing this is if I had added the 4 to each side. If I had added the 4 to each side, I would have ended up with x squared equals 4. And then you could solve it this way by taking the square root, but we have to be very careful. Remember, when we take the square root, we have to do plus or minus that root. And so we still get the positive 2 and the negative 2. Okay? For this one, the first thing we want to do is we want to bring that 14 over to see if it can be factored. So for this one, I bring the 14 over to see if I can factor this. That's x squared plus 8x plus 14. And then I build a bridge and see if I can factor it. I build a bridge and get a 14. And then two numbers that multiply to 14 but add to 8. It's not going to happen. Okay? And since that's not going to happen, I'm going to solve this one by completing the square. The first step with completing the square is I would subtract the 14 from each side, okay, to create space, which is going to bring me back to my original problem. Okay, it's going to bring me back to the x squared plus 8x with a little space equals a negative 14. And now to complete the square, I take the b value, I divide it by 2 and square it. So I'm taking this 8, dividing it by 2 and square it. So 8 divided by 2 is 4. 4 squared is 16. So I'm going to add a 16 here. Whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other side. Okay? So over here, that's going to give me an x plus 4 squared when I factor it. Over here, negative 14 plus 16 is a positive 2. And now it's just like number 4 that I did a little bit earlier. I take the square root of each side. And when I do that, I get x plus 4 equals. Again, I have to do plus or minus. And I'm just going to round this to 2 decimal places. That gives me a 1.41. And now I subtract the 4 from each side, but again, that means two things. I have to do the negative 4 plus the 1.14. Sorry, the 1.41, which gives me a negative 2.59. I also have to do negative 4 minus that, which is a negative 5.41. So those are my two answers. Okay? And that one could have been done using the quadratic formula. All right? If I take a look at the next one, again, I start off building a bridge. That gives me a negative 10. I look for two numbers that multiply to negative 10 but add to a positive 2. And once again, it's not going to happen. For this one, I would probably use the quadratic formula because there's a number in front of the x squared. Okay, so because there's a 2 out front, I'm going to use my quadratic formula, which again is the opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is a negative 5, all over 2 times a, which is a 2. So that's a negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 4. That's going to be plus 40 all over 4. And if I keep simplifying this, that gives me a negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 44 all over 4. And now I have two things to do. I have to do the negative 2 plus the square root of 44 divided by 4, which gives me a 1.16. I also have to do the negative 2 minus the square root of 44 divided by the 4, which gives me a negative 2.16. Okay, so those are my two x values. So again, if it can't be factored, either go to completing the square or your quadratic formula. If I look at the next one, I want to get everything on the same side because I always want to check factoring first just because it's so much easier than any other method. So I've got x squared plus 6x plus 10 equals 0. This one I build a bridge. It gives me a 10. Two numbers that multiply together to give me a 10 but add to a 6. It's not going to happen. Okay, so since that one cannot be factored, I'm going to try doing this one by completing the square. I'm going to subtract the 10 from each side. Because remember, I want to create space. That's x squared plus 6x with a little space equals a negative 10. And now I complete the square. I do b divided by 2 and square it. That gives me a plus 9. Whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other side. This factors into an x plus 3 squared. This gives me a negative 1. And now I take the square root of each side, and I find out right here that I can't take the square root of a negative. I can't do this piece. So that means this one is going to be no solution or no real solution. Okay? And you would have gotten the same thing if you'd done your quadratic formula. All right? For this one, I'm going to add the 3x to each side. Again, get the whole thing set equal to 0. I always want to check factoring first. That's a plus 3x plus 2 equals 0. I build a bridge. That gives me a positive 2. Two numbers that multiply to 2 but add to a 3 are a 2 and a 1. So this one is going to factor. I can use my shortcut, which is an x plus 2 and an x plus 1. And now I set each factor equal to 0 and solve each. I subtract the 2 from each side. That gives me an x equals a negative 2. I subtract the 1 from each side, and I find out that x equals a negative 1, and those are my two solutions. For number 10 here, the first thing we want to do is add that 7x to each side, because again, we want this whole thing set equal to 0, and that's going to leave me with a 3x squared plus 7x plus 10 equals 0. And now from here, we can try the same old tricks, try building a bridge. That gives me a 30. And I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to 30 but add to a 7. And again, it's not going to happen. I can't come up with those two numbers, so I either have to do completing the square or the quadratic formula. For this one, I'm going to use the quadratic formula. So I do the opposite of b, which is a negative 7, plus or minus the square root of b, which is 7 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 3, times c, which is a positive 10. And now I'm going to put that all over 2a, which is the 3. I plug it in. That's a negative 7 plus or minus the square root. That is a 49 minus 4 times 3 times 10 is 120, all over 6. And then I do the 49 minus the 120 is going to give me a negative 71. And right away, I should recognize that I can't take the square root of a negative. So this is the other way that you might come across a no solution. Okay, so you've seen it once with completing the square and once with the quadratic formula. But again, if I get a solution there, I'm going to plug it into my calculator, and I have to get two solutions like I did in the problem above it in number 7. Okay.